The story of the hidden women in Genesis reaches its conclusion with Rachel, Ella the mother, Eve, Adah, Adah, Sarah, Rebekah, Leah, and Rachel each contribute to the unfolding narrative preserved in the Torah. Rachel's final contribution is the preservation of Egypt through the wisdom hidden behind the baker. With that, the story of the hidden women in Genesis comes to its close. The Hebrew texts that follow tell the story of the conflict between prophets of the Elohim and prophets of Yahweh. The conflict begins with El Shaddai. She changes Abram's name to Abraham, the father who would serve her and the house of the Elohim. She changes Sarai's name to Sarah, establishing the mother through whom the covenant would continue. From that point forward, the names become more than the names of two individuals. They become living symbols carried through time. Ba-El, Father El, continues the mission of Abraham. Asherah continues the mission of Sarah. The first attempt to silence that tradition appears in Egypt. The baker is condemned to death for interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. Centuries later, the same conflict emerges in Israel. Gideon tears down the altar of Baal and cuts down the Asherah on Mount Carmel. Elijah calls for the destruction of the prophets of Baal. King Josiah removes Baal and Asherah from the temple. Finally, Jeremiah condemns those who continue to honor the Queen of Heaven, yet Judeans in Egypt defended worship of the Queen of Heaven. The names change, the generations pass, but the conflict remains the same. The legacy of Father El and Sarah continues beneath changing names, while the prophets and kings of Yahweh repeatedly seek to erase it. The conflict did not end with the Hebrew scriptures. In the 4th century before the Common Era, Alexander the Great conquered the Near East and introduced the Greek world to the ancient cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Alexander embraced traditions that honored the Great Mother and the broader pantheon of gods. Yet he did not seek to destroy the religious traditions of Judea. The Jews continued to worship Yahweh. The temple remained the center of Jewish life. The conflict was no longer between Greece and Judea, it now existed within Judea itself. One tradition continued to honor the compassionate partnership of El and Ella, the other proclaimed the exclusive worship of Yahweh alone. The generations that followed Alexander would inherit both traditions. Their struggle would shape the world into which Hillel, Gamaliel, and eventually the Gospel of Mark emerged. One figure stands apart in the history of Judea, a woman, Queen Salome Alexandra. In a society governed almost entirely by men, she ruled Judea for nearly a decade. Far from bringing instability, her reign became one of the most peaceful and prosperous periods in Jewish history. She strengthened the Pharisees, restored justice, and sought reconciliation after years of violence. Her appearance at this moment is remarkable. For centuries, women associated with the older tradition had been rejected, condemned, or hidden. Now, a woman openly stood at the head of the nation. Her reign demonstrated that peace was possible. Yet, that peace depended on a ruler who could hold competing factions together. When Salome died, her two sons could not agree over who should inherit the throne. Hyrcanus II claimed the kingdom by succession. Aristobulus II claimed it by force. Their struggle divided Judea. Each side sought powerful allies. Rome was drawn into the conflict. The civil war that followed ended the independence the Hasmoneans had fought to achieve. Out of that divided world emerged the generation of Hillel and later Gamaliel. The death of Queen Salome Alexandra marked the end of an era. Her son's struggle for the throne brought Roman influence permanently into Judea. Yet another struggle had been unfolding for generations. It did not concern kings, it concerned the interpretation of the Torah. Following the conquests of Alexander the Great, Greek language and culture spread throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Many Jews embraced aspects of the Hellenistic world, others resisted. The tension eventually erupted in the Maccabean revolt and the establishment of the Hasmonean kingdom. During the Hasmonean period, Judea was guided by a remarkable succession of teachers known as the Zugot, pairs of sages who shaped the nation's religious life. The final pair was Hillel and Shammai. From them emerged two houses that would profoundly influence the Judaism of the 1st century. The House of Hillel emphasized mercy, compassion, peace, and reconciliation. The House of Shammai emphasized strict observance of the law and became associated with a far less accommodating response to religious and political conflict. The Jerusalem Talmud would later summarize the division with a remarkable observation. The Torah became like two Torahs. It is within that divided world that the Gospel of Mark and the search for the hidden women must now be understood. Someone in the house of Hillel conceived an extraordinary idea. Rather than arguing with the prophets of Yahweh in the house of Shammai, they would present a story that appeared to fulfill Micah's prophecies. Not one prophecy, but two. Micah first speaks of Migdal Eder, the watchtower of the flock, great glorious mother and daughter Jerusalem, who must suffer before restoration. Only then does he announce the ruler who will come from Bethlehem. The prophecy begins with the mother and the daughter. It concludes with the Messiah. What if those two prophecies were brought together in a public ceremonial drama? What if the purpose was to persuade the people of Judea that the woman who had disappeared in Egypt, the hidden baker saved by her son, had returned as the great glorious mother, while her daughter appeared beside her, and the Messiah completed the fulfillment of Micah's vision? If so, the story preserved in Mark may have been far more than a written gospel. It may have been the script of that ceremony. If such a ceremony was introduced in Jerusalem, it would have transformed the way people understood Micah's prophecy. The story would not celebrate the Messiah alone. It would begin with Migdal Eder, continue with daughter Jerusalem, restore the great glorious mother, and culminate with the arrival of the Messiah. Many would have welcomed that message. Others almost certainly would not. To those committed to the exclusive worship of Yahweh, such a ceremony could have appeared to revive a tradition they believed had been defeated centuries earlier. The divisions remembered between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai may reflect far more than legal disagreements. Could they also preserve the memory of a deeper conflict over the role of women, the meaning of Micah's prophecy, and the identity of the Messiah? Those questions lead us to the Gospel of Mark, where we must ask whether the ceremony and the controversy surrounding it still survives beneath the text. As we turn to the Gospel of Mark, another question immediately presents itself. Throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, Yahweh is the dominant divine name. Yet Mark tells a different story. Again and again, Jesus speaks simply of the Father. He speaks of God, he prays to God. On the cross he cries out, Eloi, Eloi, or was it Ella, Ella? Mark never places the divine name Yahweh on the lips of Jesus. Instead, the relationship is between the Father and the one whom we have followed throughout this series as Ella. Is that merely a change in vocabulary? Or does it preserve the older Elohim tradition that began with El Shaddai, Abraham, Sarah, and the hidden women? That question will guide our reading of Mark from this point forward. The Gospel of Mark presents a series of remarkable puzzles. The earliest surviving manuscripts end abruptly, leaving readers with an unfinished conclusion. Mark never mentions Bethlehem or the Virgin Mother, yet Matthew and Luke clearly relied on Mark for much of their narrative. At the same time, both added material that is absent from every surviving manuscript of Mark. Those additions include the birth narratives, the Virgin Mother, Bethlehem, and other traditions familiar to later generations. Why could the Gospel we call Mark have reached us only after substantial editing, leaving Matthew and Luke to preserve fragments of an earlier tradition that no longer survives in the recovered Markan manuscripts? Or did the two evangelists respond differently to the same text? Did Matthew reshape Mark to emphasize the Yahweh tradition, while Luke sought to restore traditions that gave renewed prominence to the hidden women? Those questions will guide the final stage of our investigation. Bethlehem presents another remarkable puzzle. Mark never mentions it. Matthew places Bethlehem under the shadow of Herod the Great. The city becomes the setting for fear, slaughter, and flight into Egypt. Luke tells a completely different story. He brings Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem because of the census of Quirinius. Instead of Herod's violence, Luke emphasizes shepherds, angels, and the birth of a child in humble surroundings. Both Gospels insist on Bethlehem, yet they explain it in entirely different ways. Why? Did Matthew and Luke preserve independent memories? Or were they each attempting to explain traditions inherited from an earlier source whose original setting had already been obscured? That question brings us back to the opening of Mark, and to the possibility that Bethlehem once stood at the beginning of the story, before the surviving Greek text took the form we know today. The Virgin Mother presents another remarkable puzzle. Mark never mentions her. Matthew introduces the Virgin Mother by quoting Isaiah, "Behold, the Virgin shall conceive and bear a son." The word in Isaiah translated virgin is Alma, not Betula. Luke also presents Mary as a virgin, but tells the story in a very different way. Both Gospels insist upon the Virgin Mother. Mark does not. Why? perhaps the more important question is this. Did Matthew's appeal to Isaiah redirect attention away from an older Hebrew tradition? Throughout this series, we have followed BTLHM as more than the name of a town. It preserves the memory of the house of Elah, the mother, the virgin mother, and the hidden women whose story begins in Genesis. Even when the Gospels were written in Greek, Bethlehem appears as Bethlehem, a transliteration that still preserves the underlying Hebrew consonants BTLHM. A first-century Jewish reader familiar with Hebrew could still recognize those consonants and the meanings they carried. If that earlier Hebrew tradition stood behind the earliest form of Mark, then the central question is no longer simply whether Isaiah foretold a virgin. It is whether BTLHM originally introduced the Virgin Mother, and whether that tradition was later overshadowed by Matthew's appeal to Isaiah. That possibility invites us to read the opening of the Gospels with fresh eyes. Another remarkable feature of the Gospels deserves careful attention. Only Matthew tells the story of Herod's massacre of the children in Bethlehem. Only Matthew places Bethlehem beneath the shadow of Herod's violence. By Matthew's time, the Hasmonean dynasty that featured Alexandra Salome had already been absorbed into the Herodian house. If the Hasmoneans had preserved the ceremonial tradition we have been following, then Matthew's unique account raises an important question. Was Bethlehem simply the setting of Herod's crime? Or did the story also reshape the way later generations understood Bethlehem? Did it transform a place associated with the hidden mother into a place remembered primarily for fear, slaughter, and flight into Egypt? If so, the narrative accomplished two things at once. It permanently associated the Herodian dynasty with the murder of innocent children, and it redirected attention away from the older Hebrew tradition preserved in Bethlehem. The effect was profound. The Bethlehem remembered by later generations was Matthew's Bethlehem. The older Hebrew enigma remained hidden in plain sight. What then was missing from the Gospel of Mark? Was it simply a birth narrative, or had something far greater disappeared? What if Mark 1:9 originally began not with Jesus came from Nazareth, but with Jesus came from BTLHM, introducing the Virgin Mother, the house of Elah the mother and the daughter of Elah the mother, before introducing the arrival of the Messiah? What if the story continued as we have followed it through Genesis? What if the Virgin Mother, like the baker in Egypt, was condemned to die, and her son, like Joseph, devised a way to preserve her life? What if the climax of Mark's script celebrated the complete fulfillment of Micah's prophecy? The return of Mother Great and Glorious, the restoration of daughter Jerusalem, and the arrival of the Messiah, each fulfilling a role in the same prophetic drama. If such a ceremony was performed in the streets of Jerusalem, who would have celebrated it, and who would have opposed it? History remembers the men of the house of Hillel. It remembers Hillel, his son Simeon, his grandson Gamaliel, his great-grandson Jesus, son of Gamaliel, Elabach Alexander. For generations, the family stood at the center of Jewish religious life. Yet, the women have almost completely disappeared from history. We do not know the name of Hillel's wife. We do not know the name of Simeon's wife. We do not know the name of Gamaliel's wife. We do not know the name of Jesus, son of Gamaliel's wife. We do not know the name of Elabach Alexander's wife. The men are remembered. The women are hidden. Is that simply the nature of the surviving historical record? Or could those forgotten women have played roles every bit as important as the men whose names history preserved? If the story we have followed from Genesis is correct, then recovering the hidden women may be the final step toward recovering the forgotten history of the house of Hillel.